am recording. So welcome. I'm Ellen Teeter. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida State Oriental Medical Association. And I have a few housekeeping tips. We will open up the microphone to live questions later, partway through and then at the end. If you raise your hand, we'll unmute you and let you ask questions live, or if you don't want to do that, there is a Q&A box where you can ask questions, or if you put them in the chat. The Q&A box is where we'll be looking, but hopefully we'll see them in the chat. Andy Pham will be joining us again in a minute. He is a book lover and has referred several authors to us over the years, and he brought us this opportunity to bring Dr. Karchmer to speak. He's known him for a number of years and has known him as he was attempting to get his book published. It was published about a year ago, and so we're very happy to hear about it. It's I'm looking forward to reading it. Eric Karchmer's fascination with Chinese medicine started over 30 years ago. He had gone to Asia early in his career to teach English, and his passion eventually translated into a career, first as an academic and later as a practitioner. And now he's both. So he's been studying Chinese medicine for over 20 years, beginning his training at the renowned Beijing University of Chinese Medicine. And today he's a respected academic and practitioner of Chinese medicine. His research explores recent developments in the theory and practice of Chinese medicine in China, and he's currently completing revisions to another book. I guess you can let us know about this too, Double Truths, Postcolonial Transformations in Chinese Medicine. He holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina and a BA from Princeton, as well as his MD as AOM training in Beijing. And I'm going to let him tell us where he is now, because I'm not sure this update has the most current. I know you're planning on going back to China, so let us know a little bit about what's going on, and I'm going to go quiet.
Okay, oh, great. Well, thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Andy, for this opportunity. Really delighted to be able to speak with everyone. I'm going to just pull up my slides, make sure that's working, and then we'll launch into the talk, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Can everyone see that slide? Is that looking okay? If not, please jump in and let me know. So today I'm gonna talk a little bit about my new book, Prescriptions for Virtuosity: The Postcolonial Struggle of Chinese Medicine. I am working on a second one. It's not the title that Ellen just read, and it's still got a little ways to go, but I think that that may have been an older description of what then became this book title. I'll talk about this problem of double truths later in the talk. So let me just say a little bit about me. I do wear a couple of hats. I am a medical anthropologist, so I'm trained in anthropology, teach anthropology, I've taught for many years, with a specialty in the subfield of medical anthropology, and my research is all about Chinese medicine. In the process of becoming an anthropologist, I took a bit of a detour, and that was through the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine, and studied medicine there in the late 1990s. And you'll hear about that in this talk. And ultimately, that inspired me to also become a practitioner, become a doctor of Chinese medicine. And I've had a clinical practice now for a little over 20 years. And then lastly, I'll just mention also I'm a co-founder of a small herbal medicine company called Dao Labs, and the website is there, mydaolabs.com. And that's could be of interest to you if you're a practitioner of herbal medicine, and I definitely publish some of my more something more clinically oriented kinds of writings on the blog there. So then lastly, I'm the author of Prescriptions for Virtuosity, the book we're talking about today. You can get that on Amazon. It's available on Amazon now. It's published through Fordham University Press, so that you can also go to the website of the press. And we do have some copies for sale through Dow Labs as well. So those are a couple of different hats that I wear, and I think you'll see how they kind of led to kind of the book that I'm going to talk about today. And you'll see, I think it's an academic book, but one that's also very much oriented towards clinical practitioners. So I hope it's going to be of interest to you all. And one of the challenges of writing this book is to be to set us to do some academic things that make the academics happy, but don't turn off the doctors, and vice versa, to kind of like speak to doctors, but also in a way that academics and non-practitioners can also follow. So that's also my goal for today. We'll see if we can do both. So I'm just going to give you kind of two like big themes to kind of hold on to today. These are kind of key themes in the book. These are terms that are kind of more academic terms, and hopefully by the end of the talk they'll mean a little bit more to you. But really, two big themes in the book is this idea of hybridity and postcoloniality. Now, the latter might be a little bit unfamiliar to some of you, but if I were to summarize this book in one sentence, I might say this book traces what I call the postcolonial transformation of Chinese medicine from the early 20th century up to the present. And I focus on, and I kind of tell that story. The book tells a story across a couple different, you could say, sort of fields of practice, if you will. One is clinical practice. One is sort of understandings of the body. And the third is like diagnosis. And I'm going to focus on that last piece today, because I think that's something that's of interest to practitioners. And you'll see gets a little in the weeds on some of our technical terms, but I think this is something that will be of interest to you all. So let me just back up and say a little bit something about this term postcolonialism. It's in the subtitle to the book, and I think this can be. It's important to clarify this term, otherwise there can be some confusion about the talk. But this is a term that comes out of really comes out of South Asia. Scholars from South Asia, India, Pakistan, trying to write about this the history and also just the general sort of status of the subcontinent, particularly sort of this is the 1990s and early 2000s, but looking at this moment, this post-World War II moment where most of European and Japanese colonial possessions are decolonized, they become independent countries. But there's a way in which these countries, instead of being sort of liberated and returning to some sort of prior way of life, have already like irrevocably been pulled into sort of a modern world system, if you will, and sort of and Western standards of knowledge, law, history, political economy, medicine, what have you, all are sort of dominant in these new independent nations. They're decolonized, but so politically they're decolonized, but you could say maybe culturally or socially speaking, there's still a kind of almost a neo-colonial sort of relationship, if you will, with the West. So we're going to look and see how this plays out in the world of Chinese medicine. That kind of cultural perspective is going to be important. You'll see it's a little bit different than sometimes the way I think a lot of practitioners think about the history of Chinese medicine, and I'll try to make that clear as we go. So let me say a little bit more about some of my methods. So as an anthropologist and sort of amateur historian, let's say, anthropologists bring a kind of very particular perspective to their research, and one is one key point is that we always emphasize what's called the native's point of view. Now that's an old term. We wouldn't use the word native necessarily anymore, but it's this local, the local perspective is key. Anthropologists want to know what people on the ground think about Chinese medicine. It's or think about whatever sort of topic of research. So that local perspective is extremely important. It doesn't mean we don't look at it critically, but it's a linchpin for what anthropologists are trying to do and trying to understand. But that local perspective, which is representative of some kind of local culture, we recognize also as part of a big complex whole. We anthropologists also understand that culture is something that's not, we don't intrinsically just all understand. We participate in it, and we live through it and embody certain kinds of taken for granted assumptions about cultural practices, but we don't necessarily have a good way of articulating sort of what's important about our own culture, never mind what's important about somebody else's. So anthropologists are always sort of trying to kind of keep this notion of some sort of complex whole in mind, as they also try to understand sort of that local perspective. And another way we like to summarize this is we call this participant observation. The anthropologist is both trying to be sort of on the inside of any kind of cultural group, while sort of recognizing that he or she is never totally inside. They're also an observer, and part of your job as an anthropologist is to take your observations from within this cultural milieu and bring them outside to people from other walks of life so that they can understand it. So that sort of that perspective being inside and outside is extremely important. And that's sort of how I tried to like imagine my own relationship to Chinese medicine. I was both inside it, studying it as a student, a future practitioner, but also outside of it, looking at it as part of this broader complex. So one of the things I think I'd like to talk about today is how does that perspective help us to understand this very, very important idea in Chinese medicine of, I'm translating it here as pattern discrimination and treatment determination. The Chinese is bian zheng lun zhi. And so how does the anthropological / historical perspective help us understand this key concept, this key methodology that is very important in the world of Chinese medicine. So here we have a picture of a Dongjimen Hospital. This is one of the hospitals where I did some of my training. I was, as Ellen mentioned, a student at the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine from 1995 to 2000. And part of that time, I got to be an intern at Dongjimen Hospital. So this is one of the older hospitals of Chinese medicine in China. And one thing at this hospital, but also at the other hospitals I trained at, teachers always emphasized to me, the importance of bian zheng lun zhi. And I was always told things like, you must do pattern discrimination and treatment determination, which to me I thought was an interesting kind of statement, because it sort of raised the question as, and it almost suggested that you might not do it. You might make a mistake and forget to do it. Why would you forget to do that? Why would you forget to do this thing that's sort of, so essential to Chinese medicine? So this raised some questions for me. And so this is sort of, I had to take seriously this local perspective, but I also wanted to kind of interrogate it a bit. And so, why was it so important? And how could it be both important, but somehow maybe easily forgotten, or or not done properly, if you will. And so this is the beginning of some of my kind of like reflections on this topic. And one of the things I noticed is that as much as doctors and teachers always wanted to tell me that bian zheng lun zhi, pattern discrimination and treatment determination is the essence of Chinese medicine, if you try to look for it in your historical text, it's not there. That particular 4-character expression, bian zheng lun zhi, yes, that expression is not there in the it's not there in the Neijing, it's not there in the inner canon, it's not there in the treatise on cold damage, it's not even there in later empirical texts. So where does it come from? Well, we'll talk about this in a second. Then there was to kind of come back to this participant observation idea, and to reframe those statements about the importance of pattern discrimination and treatment determination, there is part of a bigger cultural complex. There is a bigger cultural complex that was extremely important, both at the moment I was studying, but also today, and also really for, you could say, since the 1950s. And this is the fact that Chinese medicine is always practiced together with Western medicine or biomedicine, depending on or modern medicine, depending on the term you like here. That is a relatively recent phenomena. And that's something also I was able to kind of look into more historically. But you really can't say it really happened any time before the 1950s. And even a place like Dongjimen Hospital, that picture I just showed you previously, which was founded in 1958, is sort of one of those original sites for where Chinese medicine and Western medicine are really being brought together in the same sort of institutional space for the first time. And so that's tremendously important, because historically, although Western medicine was in China before the 1950s for sure, it was around since it was important since the early 20th century, but the two medicines were not practiced really in that same space in any, at least in any sort of institutional way, until the 1950s. So kind of that, with that broader understanding, sort of my questions about pattern discrimination and treatment determination kind of sharpened, and like, how could these new broader political, social conditions of medical practice help us understand sort of the importance of this thing that we must do as students. So now, another kind of important kind of surprise or intriguing thing for me at the time was also related to this, was textbooks. So as I was a student in the late 1990s, one kind of, not super unusual thing, but still no less important that was happening, is that all the colleges of Chinese medicine in China were switching textbooks. They were switching from what was called the 5th edition. And that, if you look on the image here, that green covered textbook, that says Wenbing Xue, that says the warm illnesses studies. That textbook is an example of that 5th edition, that green cover. And we're switching to this one on the right with the purple and gold and white, and that was the 6th edition textbook. And so now I didn't think too much of it at the time. I mean, to me, I thought a textbook is a textbook, and when we typically think about textbooks, we just think of sort of, some updates, some of the latest information gets incorporated. We just sort of, we want to make sure they're, all the latest knowledge is incorporated into a new textbook. But what really caught my attention was the fact that the teachers all started complaining about the 6th edition textbook, and that was a very, very common refrain when they were lecturing. They were very frustrated that with certain statements or organization or various aspects of the 6th edition textbook, and throughout all of our courses. So we heard lots of complaints, and teachers would say it's not as good as the fifth edition. So that also really surprised me. It's like, how could we often don't think about textbooks. We just think textbooks again are sort of often they're collective things, and these are too. We just think of them as sort of everyone pooling together sort of all the contemporary sort of information on a particular field of study. So this made me wonder what makes a textbook good, and why would the 6th edition textbook, which obviously a lot of people put a lot of time into revising, why would it be of lesser quality than the 5th edition? How could we be going backwards, not forwards? So these are sort of some of my first questions that I want to look at. And as I said, as I started to dig deeper into textbooks, deeper into pattern discrimination and treatment determination, I really was surprised to kind of start to look through medical journals that you could find in the library, and find that this term didn't really exist until the 1950s. And actually, if you start looking at early textbooks, which I also did, and those were actually interesting. They're not so easy to find. You could sort of trace through the textbooks, and I do this in the book, how pattern discrimination and treatment determination gets incorporated into the textbooks. So the very earliest ones that were made for new universities of Chinese medicine in the communist period, didn't have that term. Then within just a few years, you start to see the term pop up, and you start to see this sort of declaration that pattern discrimination and treatment determination is one of the key characteristics of Chinese medicine. So this question about textbooks and this question about clinical practice are sort of coming together through the textbooks. So one of the really wonderful and just special things I got to do as part of my research was to meet with and interview many older doctors of Chinese medicine. And so this is a picture of me with Deng Tiatao, who maybe some of you have heard of. Quite famous. He's a quite famous doctor from Guangzhou, and passed away just a few years ago. He was a wonderful doctor, but also a wonderful scholar and even statesman. You could say statesman, I think, is a good word for Chinese medicine. And this is a picture with me speaking with him, I think in 2011, when he was, I believe, 94 or 95 at the time, and still pretty healthy. And he lived to be, to my knowledge, to be over 100. So I asked him about both about textbooks and about pattern discrimination and treatment determination. And he was actually quite honest with me. Most people, if you ask them about the pattern discrimination thing, it's, you kind of get an uncritical answer. Well, this is just the essence of Chinese medicine. It's always been there. And he was actually quite honest. He was like, nope, it wasn't. I don't remember as a young doctor that we did not have that term. We did not talk about that. We did not talk about that. We did not have that 4-character expression. He said, now, he said, I would say it was always there in spirit, but we didn't actually use that term. And he said, and moreover, he said, we were actually, and he happened to be an editor of many early textbooks, and some of the later ones too. He was usually most focused on Chinese medicine diagnosis. And he said, moreover, in the second edition of the textbooks, which was published in 1964, he said, we actually collectively, as kind of all the editors of the textbook and the officials who were presiding over it, decided that we would introduce this term, pattern discrimination and treatment determination, as sort of an organizing principle and key concept of Chinese medicine. So it was a very carefully thought out bit of sort of editing, if you will, and scholarship. So for me as an anthropologist, that's obviously very significant to have sort of this term which didn't exist prior to the 1950s to suddenly be like the key term in 1964. And we'll, in a little bit towards the end, I'll give you sort of my reflections on what that means. But before we do that, I thought I'd take you on a little dive into some linguistic terms here and into some Chinese texts. And hopefully this won't be too technical for you all, but I think this is the sort of thing that practitioners can wrap their minds around. And I'm assuming most people here don't have a background in Chinese, so I'm trying to kind of fill in some blanks here. But I think I want to take you through some of these changes in the Chinese language as a way to help you sort of see what I'm calling this post-colonial shift. And this will give you kind of a feel for what the book does on many different registers, but this is kind of within this realm of diagnosis. So if we look at the term, the Chinese term itself, bian, zheng, lun, zhi, which I'm using the translation pattern discrimination and treatment determination. The key term here really is that second character, zheng, this term that we typically now call pattern, and that translation of pattern really comes from Ted Kapchuk. Some people have used the word syndrome. I think pattern is a little bit better because syndrome already has its specific meanings within biomedicine. So I do like pattern. I'm going to argue that we're also going to want to introduce another translation called what I'm going to call presentation, but that's for an earlier period. And we want to make sure is that we recognize that Zheng, this term in Chinese medicine has a homonym, which is a different character, which is the word for symptom. So now a lot of characters and a lot of words in Chinese medicine, in Chinese, are binomials. So if we did a 2-character term for pattern, that would be zheng ho, and if we did a 2-character term, a binomial for symptom, that would be zheng zhuang. But if you also just look at the characters, you can see they're different characters. We need to kind of recognize that these two words are homonyms, but they're different characters, and that's going to be very important for this little story we're going to talk about today. And there's one more important term here, which is this term being in Chinese medicine, which can be translated as disease, and that's certainly what it means in the context of Western medicine. In the context of Chinese medicine, it's much bigger than that. And it's but it is sort of a way of categorizing something like a disease, but maybe the word disorder might be a better term, because it doesn't line up with our biomedical diseases. So what I want to do is just do a little historical dive into this term zheng, the term we now call pattern, and I'm going to say it should really be called presentation up until sort of the up until really sort of the 1950s or 60s. And so my argument from that, one important piece of evidence comes from a dictionary. This is the first dictionary of Chinese medicine. It's called the Comprehensive Dictionary of Chinese Medicine. So intriguingly, Chinese medicine didn't have dictionaries before this time. Had lots of other things, but nobody had quite thought to make a dictionary. But Xie Guan is a very famous scholar and doctor of the early 20th century China. Gives us this definition, and he says, zheng, and I'm going to leave it untranslated for the moment, is the external expression of an internal disorder, like the verification of an object. And I want to pause here for a moment. This term zheng also has some other uses in Chinese that mean more or less verification, or to determine or verify. So, for example, liver bing, that's a term for disorder. Liver disorder, let's say, is manifested by poor vision. A kidney disorder by poor hearing. A lung disorder by poor olfaction, heart by rigid tongue, et cetera, et cetera. And if you look at this, these are all sort of 5 phases, 5 elements, kinds of connections between the body and its orifices. Based on this little passage here and other things that I'll discuss in the book, I think we can see that a better translation, zheng here, I don't think quite means the term pattern, and I would argue a better translation is this term presentation. And if we think of as presentation, what we can see here is that zheng and bing have this kind of inside-outside relationship. Bing is the disorder on the inside, some sort of pathological disorder. Zheng is this sort of clinical presentation. It's not something that's structured as a pattern. It's just a sort of how something internally is expressed externally. So quite like this first expression, the first sentence of the definition here. So the external expression of an internal order. So that's interesting. So that's a very different. So that's a very different use of that term, and that also explains why something like bianzheng lunzhi doesn't quite exist in the 1920s, because nobody's using zheng in those nobody's using it in the contemporary ways that we use it, a la pattern. Now I'm going to take you again through a few more academic articles here, so bear with me, but hopefully you'll start to see the shifts here. And I want you to just kind of point to a couple also early 20th century scholars. Liu Yanlei is a very famous one. And I want to show you how you can see sort of a small shift in meaning in this term zheng. So I think presentation is still the best translation. But here we see Liu Yanlei making an argument that just asking the question, what is zheng? You can see it's up for grabs with him. It's suddenly not this thing that everyone understands. And he says, zheng is zheng ho, the binomial, also the standard for using medicine. All the terms from the treatise on cold damage and essentials of golden casket are zheng ho, such as fever, chills, stiffness in the neck and back, fullness in the chest and flanks, irritability, thirst, palpitations of the heart, palpitations below the umbilicus, fullness below the heart that is soft to the touch, sweating, absence of sweating, heart stools, et cetera, et cetera. These are all Zheng Ho, and they can't be simply understood by just looking at a text. A famous teacher must explain them, or one must read about them in excellent commentaries. So those kinds of presentations can't just be understood at, they're not just, it can't just be understood by reading about them. You either have to have the guidance of a teacher or of, very good commentaries on these classic texts. He goes on to say in a separate article, but written in the exact same year, that presentation, here I'm using my translation, is not the same as the concept of symptom. And so we have the two different terms here, Chinese terms, as found in Western medicine texts. Symptoms only describe the abnormal state of the patient, but have nothing to do with diagnosis and treatment. The Zheng Ho of Zhongjing, this is Zhang Zhongjing, the author of the treatise on cold damage and the Essentials of the Golden Coffer, work as their criteria for how to use medicine. So what we're seeing here set up with Liu Yanlei, another important scholar of this period, is an opposition between presentation and symptom to make them different. What's significant, and I don't think I have I don't have a slide on it, but let me just explain what's significant here that I didn't explain, but it's actually in that definition by Xie Guan. If we look more closely, he's also got a commentary on this thing. What's significant here is that the two different characters, the two Zheng, if you will, putting aside the second characters, the rest of the binomial, the two Zheng in late imperial times are actually the same word. They both mean presentation. They both mean presentation, and they're used either interchangeably or just as authors prefer. So you can read some books which like to use the one character, which is a little more complex. Some like to use the second character. It's a little bit simplified, a little bit easier to write, if you will. But in late imperial writing, this is sort of, let's say, from the 1500s on, maybe even earlier. You can definitely find late imperial texts that use either of these two characters, but they use it in the exact same way as, or very close to what Xie Guan said. That's this sort of this term for presentation, the clinical presentation of some sort of internal disorder. Here in 1929, we have Liu Yanlei trying to make a distinction, saying one character is the character that's important for Chinese medicine. He's going to give that a full binomial here, Zheng Ho. This other character is going to be important for talking about Western medicine. And what's, of course, significant, what's happening very importantly in the early 20th century is that Western medicine texts are getting translated into Chinese at this time. And doctors and scholars are coming up with translations for key terms in Western medicine. And so what's happened is the translation, the second Zheng has become the translation for symptom. And now Chinese medicine scholars are sort of trying to pull those two characters apart and make one refer to Chinese medicine and make one refer to Western medicine. Now, this is sort of, Liu Yanlei is kind of a first shot at this. This takes some time for this to happen, and I'll talk a little bit, but that's ultimately how we get to pattern discrimination and treatment determination, but that still takes several decades. I'm going to give you one more slide here, which is to maybe explain a little bit of the history here. Where does Liu Yanlei, this famous Chinese scholar, get his ideas? Well, another little surprising historical twist here is that he's actually quite inspired by some scholars of Japanese Kampo medicine. We don't have time to get into it, but there's a whole there's some fascinating kind of work happening within the field of Kampo medicine in the early 20th century, and that starts to become influential in China, partly because of the rise of Japan. Japan's becoming a powerful nation in Asia in the early 20th century. So Japanese Kampo writings are finally kind of making it back to China, and scholars like Liu Yanlei are reading them. And so one text that for sure Liu Yanlei was referring to is a text by Yamato Kyoshin, who wrote a very fascinating book called written in 1927, translated in 1928, 1 year before Liu Yanlei's articles. He writes, the symptomatic therapy of Western medicine and the adjust the therapy to the presentation approach of Campo medicine look similar, but are different. And I won't read any more of that. You can read it if you want. But what's important if you're looking at the Chinese is the symptomatic therapy. Yamamoto Kyoshin is very careful to use that new term for symptom, the new biomedical term, and he's contrasting it to the adjust the therapy to the presentation, 随症症治, 随症治治. Excuse me. That four character expression actually is an expression that comes from the treatise on cold damage by Zhang Zhongjing. Now here, Yamamoto Kyoshin and many of his colleagues in Japan, but also folks like Liu Yanlei, are very interested in the treatise on cold damage, and they're trying to sort of elevate it and sort of saying it's representative of sort of the best of Chinese medicine. They're trying to take this term, make it into something different. Now, again, it's still not pattern discrimination and treatment determination, but what's important here is that you have a sort of separation of terms. We have this linguistic divide emerging, and that's what Liu Yanlei is picking up on. Now, I'm going to just fast forward to 1996. I won't take you through the early textbooks, but the 1996 textbooks, this is the 6th edition textbook. This is the one that my class at the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine was starting to use, is the first textbook that actually tries to define terms. So before that, earlier textbooks might say something like pattern discrimination and treatment determination, 辩证论治, is a key characteristic of Chinese medicine, but it didn't try to define zheng, it didn't try to define bing, it didn't try to define the key terms here. So we do see this in the 6th edition. So this is some, many decades later, 75, 75, yes, 70 or 70 some, not quite, yeah, it's about 70 years later. So if you look at the definitions, and I apologize, I didn't really translate the first one, but here we see this word bing. It's translated, and it says, sorry, I'll translate it here. It's refers to the etiology and presentation and pathomechanism and developmental principles, as well as resolution of an entire process. In other words, in the textbook here, they're trying to define Bing as the word disease, although it has different uses. Like I said, this is more like disorder in Chinese medicine. Now, when we look at zheng, this is the one that I didn't translate it here, but this is the one where the Chinese says a specific clinical presentation. This is the one that Liu Yanlei and Yamamoto Kyoshin were saying is different, is just symptom. And so that's symptom. And if we then look at zheng, the one that becomes pattern, interestingly, the definition here, translated, it says, it describes a stage of a pathological generalization and the development process of a disease. So that feels like a pretty kind of technical, biomedical almost definition here, but it's trying to say that that pattern represents stages of development within a disease process, disease being a biomedical disease. Now, the way the term pattern is used in Chinese medicine, it is certainly more than just that stage of pathological generalization. It's certainly more than that. It refers to other things than that. But this is sort of the first edition where we try to get a definition of these terms. So part of my research is to sort of looking at this historical transformation and then trying to reflect on the process. So this might be a good time to this is going to be a good time to pause for some questions. So so then I'm going to kind of try to give you analysis of some of these linguistic shifts. How do we go from presentation to pattern, and what are the implications for the practice of Chinese medicine? So that'll be sort of the remainder of the talk, but let's just pause. I suspect there probably are some questions from you all about the little I just talked about.
Yeah, if you have one, raise your hand and we'll open up your mic. Or you can put them in the chat or Q&A. So it's interesting to me that this basis, and I'm thinking of Zhang Fu patterns, were not in there earlier. And I know when I've looked at Shanhan Lung, it's descriptions of disease symptoms. It doesn't talk about the pattern. So
Yeah.
I'd never
Yes.
realized this before.
Yes, so that's a great point, Alan. And so if you and in some other papers and other chapters in the book, I do a bigger dive into how folks like Liu Yanlei were reading, or Yumoto Kyoshin were reading the Shanghanlun. And yes, it doesn't, it's really sort of a list of, if we could call it a list of symptoms. Now, what Liu Yanlei and Yumoto Kyoshin want to say is that list is significant. It's a constellation, if you will. Ultimately, we might call it you can even call it a pattern, but it's the cluster of them together that makes it distinctive from just a single one. If we say fever, that doesn't tell, we don't know what to do in Chinese medicine. But if we say fever, chills, lack of sweating, and I think it's a wiry tight pulse, then we know we should use our ephedra decoction for that. So it's that cluster. But it isn't quite the same as Zhang Fu. It isn't quite the same as our internal organ pattern discrimination. And I think part of that elevation, and I talk a little bit about this in the book as well, part of that elevation of the Zhang Fu Bianzheng pattern discrimination comes with the textbooks, actually even has some influence from some biomedical doctors. That there's some other kind of really interesting side stories here. And partly also because I think that just feels a little bit more material. It feels a little bit more tangible. It's the sort of thing that Western medicine doctors, but also just modern folks can hang on to. And this is sort of a challenge. This is a question I actually asked some of these older doctors I got to interview. One of the things I wanted to know is, like, was it hard for you to study Chinese medicine? Because it was hard for me, and it felt hard for all my classmates. And I think people struggle to kind of like, how do we move between biomedicine and Western medicine? Biomedicine and Chinese medicine. What are these terms? How do these two medical systems relate to each other? A lot of students, and I think young doctors, are trapped kind of moving back and forth between the two. And these older doctors said, oh, that was never a problem for us because we didn't know Western medicine. We just learned Chinese medicine. We watched our teacher do it from the beginning as we were learning. So the concepts kind of were intimately tied to clinical practice, and not so foreign. Yeah.
Does the book, maybe I missed it when you were talking, when you were a student, the 5th and 6th edition, you learned the 6th edition and the teachers were complaining. What is the significant difference between those two editions? Did you look at that?
Yes, a good question. I think that the 6th edition just brought in a little bit more biomedicine. The editors were and that's in general, the editors, they might do things like make those equivalences. For example, they would you might have a Chinese medicine being, let's call it actually, this is in the start of the book. Actually, the opening chapter of the book, the introduction, gives an example of this. We have a disorder of something called Shongbi, so chest obstruction. And what does that mean in Chinese medicine? Well, what does that mean in Western medicine? Shongbi is so chest obstruction. We can interpret that in a lot of ways. But what does that mean in Western medicine? Well, that's the sort of thing that the 6th edition textbook wants to do, and they're going to make an equivalency between something like a heart attack, coronary heart disease, they're going to connect it very closely to heart disease, the thing that people usually went to. And in that sort of opening vignette, my teacher explains, or this one particular teacher explains, says, that's completely wrong. And he says, here's an example of a pneumonia that I'm going to treat with, in that the same way I'm going to treat it through this idea of chest blockage. And it's not a heart condition, but if we get confused by those kinds of equivalencies, then we're going to go down the wrong path and not treat it well and things like that. So the 6th edition does little things like that. And actually the textbooks have kind of moved on. Now they've kind of, now different editorial and different press houses have kind of produced their own textbooks. But what sort of friends of mine that are teachers say is they always go back to the 5th edition for all the test questions. So they may be forced to teach different textbooks, but the 5th edition sort of still remains the gold standard for all the test questions. And that's the one I think where people felt like it kind of stays within the realm of Chinese medicine. It obviously has lots of influence. It still has lots of influences for Western medicine. That's also kind of part of the argument of the book, but it does a pretty good job of being very modest in sort of claims it makes, whereas the 6th edition is tries to be much bolder. So, I think Andy, I see a question, and there may be Andy. Do you want to ask a question?
I'll make this very brief because I know we maybe have a minute here, but Dr. Karshmer, we have someone who just put something in the Q&A, and I'll just make this short and simple. Rob Hoffman is with us today. He, I believe, is the CEO at Yosan University in LA, which is in my home state. My assumption is that he may have found out about this event through CSOMA, which I shared it with, rather than FSOMA. He asked very briefly, what are the implications of this relative to modern acutherapy? In parentheses, he says, think integration of Asian and allopathic models. I think that you can answer this briefly if you have a minute, but it might be related to what you put on the slide about what are the implications for the contemporary practice. If you prefer, you can defer maybe that question until you bring up the implications of contemporary practice.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a great question, and I think actually the second half of the talk will really try to answer that as best I can. But I think it gets back to this. Going to get back to this term hybridity. So that I don't know if I know his precise reference, but I think to me that's referring some sort of mixture of Chinese medicine and Western medicine, and that becomes sort of this idea of hybridity of blending the two medical systems becomes sort of the key. Becomes a key result, if you will, of something like pattern discrimination and treatment determinant. It becomes one of the defining characteristics, from my perspective as an anthropologist, of contemporary Chinese medicine. So maybe this is a good time to kind of continue with this is going to slightly get a little bit more theoretical. This will be a little bit more unfamiliar to you all, but hopefully understandable, and then we can kind of circle back to some of these sorts of questions. So this little example that I tried to kind of hint at here, from the shift from presentation to pattern, is part of what I'm calling sort of these postcolonial transformations of Chinese medicine. And in fact, what I do argue in the book is that this isn't like one thing. I've tried to give you a very small example, and one that's, sorry if it's too technical, but it's a technical one that at least was relevant to practitioners. But it's really a global thing. It affects all aspects of Chinese medicine. And this is going to be this idea of postcoloniality, which then kind of in turn results in these kind of new hybrid practices. And postcolonialism is a term, sometimes it can be a little confusing. Some people think of it as even pejorative, and it certainly refers to kind of an imbalance of power. But for me, the hybridity and the innovation is also something that's really, really fascinating. And so I don't want us to kind of, for anyone to be confused and think I don't recognize that and appreciate that. Just the opposite. I find it super, super interesting. So to help you kind of think about like sort of how broad this idea of postcolonial is, I think all you have to do is actually start with the names. If you're in China, you'll very quickly find out there's two types of main types of medicine in China. There's Chinese medicine, which is what all of us do, and they don't even use the word traditional Chinese medicine or TCM. I can circle back to that. There's an interesting little side history of that, but they just use the word Chinese medicine and Western medicine. So and they don't use biomedicine, or they sometimes might, but in general, it's Western medicine. So what I find most fascinating is that the standardized terms for the two main medical systems in China are terms that are sort of geographic, if you will, in their sort of denomination. One is referring to the East and one is referring to the West. So there's these hints of kind of colonial histories in the very terms itself, and that's not accidental. And so one scholar that helps us to think about this is a great scholar, Edward Said, who passed away in 2003, and he wrote a very famous book called Orientalism, which I recommend to all of you. And it's a look at how it's an attempt to sort of understand the power inequalities that sort of relate West to East. And he makes this argument, and now we have to kind of think, we have to kind of also kind of keep in mind sort of this bigger history that's looking at here. But the very term Orient, West, these are these terms that sort of emerged out of European colonization of the world. And he argues that, and a lot of what sort of people, what scholars want to define as the Occident is in many ways defined vis-a-vis the Orient. That first, that's the Near East, and then that's the Far East. And he traces that history very, very carefully, and then later through even the post-World War II period, where you have sort of the rise of American power, and then on sort of the geopolitical stage, and how sort of Orientalist tropes continue, although through kind of things like area studies and different academic formations. But the main point he wants to argue is that there's no such thing as East and West. This is just discourse, is the term he would use. These are just academic creations, but they're creations that are extremely powerful, and they have a way of sort of defining two regions of the globe against each other. Although there's nobody can point to some sort of imaginary line in the map that divides East and West, or North from South, or things like that. And so I think there's something like this that's analogous that's happening within the world of Chinese medicine too. Chinese medicine is always defined vis-a-vis Western medicine in China, and this is extremely powerful. I think here in the U.S. maybe it's a little bit hard to appreciate the power of that reference. But if you're in China, you're in a hospital of Chinese medicine, what you find, and this is perhaps one of the maybe there should be a third surprise for me. What you find is that doctors of Chinese medicine are doing Western medicine all the time. They're doing biomedicine all the time. They're moving back and forth between these two disciplines, not just on an occasional basis. It's with every patient. So they really have to be masters of two types of medicine in a way that we don't have to be when we practice acupuncture or Chinese medicine in the West. We want to know a little bit about biomedicine, but most of the time we can feel pretty safe that folks have kind of been around the block, gotten a diagnosis, and they're coming to us for something maybe chronic, something that sort of falls through the cracks of Western medicine. Whereas doctors in China are sort of on the front lines, and they have lots of patients coming in with all kinds of problems and no diagnosis, and they're moving back and forth between the two. And so West and East are continually being sort of defined against each other. Now, one very important influence for Edward Said is another great scholar, Michel Foucault. And Foucault has a definition of power, which is at the basis of sort of what Said's trying to talk about, which is that power is this thing that's disseminated. It's in particular in discourse. He wants to emphasize how it's in language, but also institutions and practices. and it's not a repressive force such as sort of some sort of repressive state organization. Instead, it's something that's just distributed throughout a society, or throughout some sort of field of practice, if you will. Certainly, there's going to be people who have maybe more power than others, so to speak. But nobody has all the power, and nobody has absolutely no power. So Foucault, for that reason, is very dismissive of this idea of some sort of negative notion of power, where it's sort of state forces repressing us, holding us down, although he clearly recognizes that. But I think this is an important point, because I often hear, or I've given a version of this talk in other sort of venues with Chinese medicine practitioners, and often people wanted to hear sort of, they were a little bit frustrated with this story because they wanted to hear about how doctors got oppressed in the Cultural Revolution, or they got locked up for doing this or that, or how the state prevented Chinese medicine from developing. Well, the state certainly plays an extremely important role here. But if we limit it to just sort of this idea of state repression, then we can't get the full story of Chinese medicine, and we can't understand how things were happening before there's a communist state, and how things and why things happen in a certain way even under the communist order. So Foucault was a very important person for introducing this disseminated notion of power, which is what Said is trying to help us see, how things like East and like notions of East and West, which are so deep, we often don't even question those terms, then kind of get rolled into like competing medical systems, and Chinese medicine becomes opposed to Western medicine. So one of the things I try to sort of trace throughout the book, and I find this really interesting, is if you look historically, and you compare sort of let's say the pre-communist period, early 20th century, with sort of with the communist period, you can see how this relationship with Western medicine also shifts dramatically. So one of the things I was really stunned to read about, and I think it's very surprising, is that before the 1950s, doctors of Chinese medicine were quite confident about their clinical skills, and often talked about Western medicine as being precise and scientific and very interesting, but as clinically not particularly useful. So that kind of statement is repeated again and again and again. Now, what was of interest to those like Liu Yanlei and those early scholars, early 20th century scholars, were things like anatomy, which perhaps could be used to explain certain aspects of Chinese medicine, or help us refine our understanding of the organs, or things like that. But it's important to note it's only a very, very small number of elite doctors. These are sort of the most highly educated doctors, who are then also kind of not only reading the Chinese medicine classics, but then also diving into having the sort of modern education and skills to sort of dive into scholarship on Western medicine. Now, after the 1950s, things changed a lot, and that relationship changed fundamentally. And so Western medicine becomes very authoritative. And that was just clear to me in the hospital again and again and again. We start first with a Western medicine diagnosis, and then we start thinking about how we treat with Chinese medicine. But we've got to get the Western medicine diagnosis is absolutely crucial for many reasons. And then sort of Chinese medicine can come in. Once we figure out what's going on, and by that people mean in terms of Western medicine, then we can start treating with Chinese medicine. So doctors of Chinese medicine, had to study Western medicine in the 1950s. All students of Chinese medicine are these days very skilled at Western medicine, and in fact that becomes and this is something I describe in the book too. That becomes sort of one of the main things that young doctors do, is they really actually master their skills of biomedicine first, get very competent in that, and then only later in their careers kind of come back and try to get the clinical skills to be a good doctor of Chinese medicine. So there's a dramatic, that's one aspect of this shift that I try to trace in the book. There's a very different relationship with Western medicine before, let's say roughly the 1950s and after. And so one of the things I look at in the book, and I'm just going to kind of give you some quick summaries here, is why does this shift happen? I'm going to call it a paradigm shift. I'm going to explain that term in a second. Well, there's a couple important reasons that we need to look at. So one is really demographics. In the early 20th century, there was very few doctors of Western medicine, and in the beginning, sort of in the 50s and 60s, there was a growing number of doctors of Western medicine, and now they're by far the dominant medical profession in China by a ratio of maybe 4 to 1 or something like that. Whereas in the 1920s and 30s, it might have been flipped. It might have been 10 to 1 Chinese medicine to Western medicine. Another important thing, as I just kind of tried to point to, and clinically speaking, it becomes in the hospital, and there isn't really sort of so much private practice like we have here in the US, where people just, or like my own clinic, people just come to me and I treat them however I want. Most Chinese medicine care happens in a hospital or in some sort of larger state-run clinic, although there is some diversification of that now, but certainly where people are trained are going to be these hospitals and large clinics, where a double diagnosis is required, meaning that you have to diagnose both in Chinese medicine and Western medicine. That becomes absolutely fundamental. And that's just very different than the way Chinese medicine used to be practiced before the 1950s, where it was primarily in small clinics, private clinics. There wasn't sort of an institutional structure behind it. And many doctors just saw patients in their clinic. The typical pattern would be patients would come to the clinic in the morning, and then in the afternoon, the doctor would make house visits to those who couldn't come, weren't mobile enough, or had the financial resources to pay for the doctor to make a house call in the afternoon. And then another fundamental difference between that, where the 50s are sort of kind of a divide, is medical training, as I already discussed. Before, in that early period, doctors of Chinese medicine knew very little about very little about Western medicine, if nothing, maybe even nothing at all. Might not even know it existed. And then in the communist period, they're all required to learn it now. And not everyone feels bad about that, by the way, I should say too. But and I can give you many examples of that shift. But I remember asking one doctor early on in some of my interviews, one of my first questions was, why would you even want to study Chinese medicine? Because in the 1920s and 30s, there was already, among a Chinese intellectual, there's already a dismissal of Chinese medicine as backwards. There was already attacks on Chinese medicine in those periods as being something superstitious, not scientific. And I remember asking one of my early interviewees, I was like, so, if all these people are writing in the papers that Chinese medicine is superstitious, why would you even want to study it? And his response was, it was kind of like earth-shattering. He was like, "Oh, I was just a kid from the countryside." This is sort of he was probably born in I think around early 1920s, 1921, 22. So I was just a kid from the countryside. I didn't even know there was another kind of medicine, meaning other than traditional Chinese medicine. He said, until I came to Beijing years later, when he was in his late teens. He said, I had no idea there was whole other type of practice that came from someplace else. And that was typical. In the countryside, there was almost no Western medicine at all. In that early, what's called the Republican period, pre-1949 period. So here's a little chart I made just to kind of help you see how the numbers have shifted. Kind of informal estimates. I don't know how good the statistics are, but from like 1949, right at the beginning of the communist era, people estimated that there's roughly 500,000 doctors of Chinese medicine. Now, what is a doctor of Chinese medicine? That definition is a little bit loose, and it may have included a lot of people who would hardly be called doctors by our modern standards. And there's only, I think, 38,000 doctors of Western medicine in China at that time. And those doctors would have, some of them would have been trained in China, but a large number would have gone to Japan or Europe or the United States to train. Maybe half would have gone abroad to train, and maybe half were trained in China. And there would have been some marked disparities too between those doctors as well. So what you see after 1949 is a real push to build the Western medicine profession in China by the Communist Party. You see a big drop in number of practitioners. Now, people have made different arguments about why. There could be many social changes could be part of it. Certainly one big thing was sort of just licensing requirements, as the state tried to introduce like sort of licensing and tests to get a license. There's many people who claim to be doctors that maybe couldn't at least pass the licensing tests. But in general, you sort of see a kind of a general stagnation, and by 1965, a real takeoff in the number of doctors of Western medicine until we get to these. I haven't followed it through to contemporary times, but I don't think that ratio has changed much. If it's only gotten maybe starker. So let me come back to this idea of colonialism, post-colonialism a little bit more, just to kind of sum it up. Scholars of China sometimes call that pre-1949 period a period of semi-colonialism, because China wasn't totally dominated by European power or by the Japanese, only parts of it were. One of the interesting things is that the impact on Chinese medicine was quite limited. And we see the emergence of things kind of like what's called the convergence school. That's we could take that up in the questions, but that's a school of Chinese medicine where people try to borrow little bits of Western medicine, particularly anatomy, to sort of develop Chinese medicine. And there's this general feel that Chinese medicine is clinically superior. In the post-colonial, what I'm calling the post-colonial period, so remember, this is the period where China's no longer dominated by these European or Japanese powers. You see kind of this growing domination of Western medicine, and the impact is enormous. Suddenly doctors of Chinese medicine have to learn two types of medical systems. There's a real push to sort of integrate the two. That begins in the late 1950s. That's a big something of big interest to Mao Zedong himself. But there's more and more Chinese medicine is kind of tied to, but also distinct from Western medicine. And that's because Western medicine is now unquestionably sort of the authoritative thing. Although the colonial powers are gone, but the sort of the authoritativeness, the hegemony of Western medicine, that's undisputed in the post-1950s period. So I think it creates, in terms of post-colonialism, this creates this kind of complex problem for doctors of Chinese medicine, and in a sense, we all experience this, although it's, I think, more acute for doctors in China. But an expression I often heard doctors say to me would be, you could translate something like this: Chinese medicine is scientific too. There's always sort of also to, in addition, was kind of always implied. So this Western medicine was sort of unquestionably scientific, and Chinese medicine, doctors would say, well, we also do science, but one of the challenges is it has to be a little bit different. We're Chinese, we're not Western. And so doctors of Chinese medicine were very committed to the scientific value of Chinese medicine. I think like all practitioners are, we all believe it's true in some way, but it's true in a way that's different than Western medicine. And in a certain sense, it's a kind of lesser truth. It's true also. It's not the dominant way of understanding the body or doing medicine. It's just a lesser truth. And I think that power relation, which defines the colonial period, then becomes a key to sort of what I think becomes various forms of hybridity, various ways of mixing the two together, but also keeping them separate. So what we have then as a consequence of this sort of double truths kind of scenario is what I would call sort of a whole paradigm shift. I think pattern discrimination and treatment determination is kind of the classic example of that, but I trace it through sort of ways in which we understand the body, or the ways we treat acute and chronic diseases and things like that. This term paradigm shift, just to give you a background on that, comes from Thomas Kuhn, who is the author of The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And this is considered to be, I think this is still true, the highest selling, most popular, most popular by that standard, academic book ever written in 1962, and it's sold millions of copies. So it's a wonderful book written by a great historian of science. And Kuhn makes an argument that scientific revolutions are always followed by kind of a normalization of a new paradigm. So his classic example is sort of the Copernicus revolution. So in the ancient world, we have Ptolemaic astronomy, where the Earth is at the center of the solar system. With Copernicus, the sun replaces the Earth as the center. What he argues is that in the aftermath of these sort of revolutions, history then becomes sort of a way of thinking of evolution of knowledge. We sort of see knowledge always as kind of getting closer and closer to the final truth of something. So earlier kind of scientific claims, say Ptolemaic astronomy, are dismissed as mistakes or just a stepping stone to the current paradigm, to the current evolution of knowledge. And he really argues against that. He says paradigm shifts are based on whole new ways of thinking about problems. He says, but they don't necessarily get us closer to total knowledge. They just represent a whole new system of organizing and thinking about knowledge. He says it's only sort of in our textbooks that come after the paradigm shift that sort of, they're sort of normalized. The revolution becomes normalized, and the past way of doing things just becomes all is written off as mistakes. But up until the revolution, Ptolemaic astronomy was this powerful form of astronomy. Or we can take any example sort of in biology or chemistry or other fields of practice that he looks at issues that before we have some sort of revolution, nothing was, there were small areas of disagreement and contention, but he said, there were sort of other paradigms that were in place that worked, reasonably well until sort of the revolution comes along. So I think something analogous happens with Chinese medicine. We have the textbooks play perhaps an even more important role, if you will, of driving the revolution, and that's where pattern discrimination and treatment determination becomes sort of normalized, becomes interpolated into the practice of Chinese medicine, where it becomes so this is one of the key elements of what I call the postcolonial transformation of Chinese medicine. So when doctors call it when my teachers were calling it the essence of Chinese medicine, I would say in many ways it kind of is, because that is the way, that is certainly the dominant way that we do Chinese medicine, but it's not in the sense that it's some sort of timeless aspect of Chinese medicine. Instead, and I won't walk you through all the arguments here, but I think what's most important about biomedical or pattern discrimination and treatment determination, and you can see this when I kind of analyze hospital practices, is that it becomes a way of negotiating the relationship between Western medicine and Chinese medicine. And for here, I have a whole analysis of sort of like how you write a hospital record that really kind of show it. But it becomes a way of kind of both separating, like there's this unique thing we do with Chinese medicine about pattern, but also integrating. It does both at the same time, because you can also make pattern, just like that definition from the 1996 textbook, you can make pattern a sort of a subset or a pathological moment in the evolution of a disease. So you can say, you can do things like say, pattern describes some sort of disease variant, or describes a stage in the disease process, and that's essentially sort of what a lot of our clinical textbooks do. They present pattern as here, treat, if the disease is at this stage, treat it, if it's an upper respiratory tract infection early on, we're going to treat it with maybe cinnamon twig decoction. If it starts getting into the lungs, we start getting some asthma, then we might use the green dragon or blue dragon, Qimong Tang formula, things like that, and you can kind of you can sort of set up your patterns as ways of following a disease process. So I think the thing that's really radical about pattern discrimination and treatment determination is it both is a way of kind of keeping Chinese medicine distinct from Western medicine. Here's a whole diagnostic category that doesn't exist in biomedicine, but also as it also facilitates some different kinds of integration, some different kinds of hybridity. So hybridity is a interesting term here, this blending of East and West, and that's something that postcolonial scholars writing about the postcolonial kind of condition often emphasizes, how traditional knowledges get blended with modern knowledges in these very kind of innovative ways. I'll give you kind of just maybe the smallest example of another shift. So this relates to kind of some of the stuff on the body, but on the cover of the book is an image that's come from the same book here as this 1906 text, and you can see the 1906. The image on the left here is a realistic human being with some points located on a body that looks like relatively familiar. That's anatomically sort of relatively correct. I love the fact that the model here is dressed in sort of late Qing attire, and not our modern time. But this is sort of one of the earliest texts that sort of tries to use a realistic human being to describe where points or meridians are. Though the image on the right is from 1601, and it's not a super realistic looking human being. And if you look at any of these sort of early, these earlier, so in other words, late imperial sorts of images, we don't see realistic human beings at all. And what we do see starting in the 1950s is an image like we have here on the right, which is a realistic, which is the meridian pathway drawn on. This is the I think it's this Xiaoyang meridian here, drawn on a realistic, often it's male model, yes, back then it was always the male model. We see it drawn on the body in a way that we can, can recognize the relative structures, and we can see it also relating to some of the inner organs of the body, kind of roughly knowing where it might go in a body which has organs and structures that we recognize inside. That's different than what you would have seen in any kind of imperial text. And so one of the things that come back to this term hybridity that I argue is that what happens in the post-colonial period, in the sort of post-1950 period, and I think it's something that we all are kind of trapped into a degree, is this dilemma of kind of trying to purify Chinese medicine, trying to sort of say it's distinct from Western medicine, it's completely unique, but then it's also possible to kind of integrate it with and to combine it with. And this is sort of this kind of double truths, epistemological kind of conundrum for all doctors of Chinese medicine. So another example of this that I look at in another chapter of the book, as I say, we're kind of stuck between what we call the structural body, this is more or less the anatomical body, and kind of the functional body. We sort of say Chinese medicine treats functional problems in the body, but not the structural anatomical ones. So we often kind of make these purifications, if you will. We oppose Chinese medicine to Western medicine. We reproduce that East versus West opposition in our own language and discourse, and then in practice, we kind of find ways to kind of bring them back together after having sort of separated them in a particular way. So that to me, our modern acupuncture images, if you kind of think about it, are the perfect example of that. We have sort of realistic sort of human models with relatively correct anatomy, and then acupuncture meridian traced onto it, something that seemingly has no anatomical reference to it. So, and this is my last slide. And so if we got a little bit too heady with the theory here, I do want to make sure I close on kind of a hopeful note, which is that I think Chinese medicine has been powerfully shaped in this, late 20th century and early 21st century in some ways that we only are vaguely appreciative of. It's certainly been under attack, and I haven't emphasized that, but it's been under attack since the early 20th century by many Chinese elite, and certainly during the communist period. Although in the last 10, 15 years, there's been much more of a celebration of it. Those power inequalities have had a powerful influence on the shape of Chinese medicine. But I think the hopeful part is that doctors of Chinese medicine, this is particularly true in China, but it's also true of us too, are extremely knowledgeable in two forms of medical practice, right? They master, that's part of the postcolonial condition. They must master Chinese medicine and Western medicine. And if they do that, there's something kind of really wonderful that can happen there. There's going to be certain kinds of innovation and hybridity emerges. And I think many, I can give some examples in the questions and answers if you want. Many super innovative therapies have come out of this, right? Where we can take a Western medicine diagnosis and explain it, or chart sort of certain kinds of Chinese medicine therapies that wouldn't have been possible in an earlier time because we wouldn't have had that diagnosis, that biomedical knowledge to work with. So I think innovation becomes possible. A certain kind of innovation becomes possible. There's also other kinds of limitations. So there's a trick to navigating it all. But I think lastly, and this is sort of the last chapter of the book and the title of the book, this is I really sort of try to focus on that side of virtuosity. And I think sort of whatever the flaws of pattern discrimination and treatment determination, and I know there's lots of critiques out there about textbooks, there's lots of critique about what people call TCM. There's still always the possibility of sort of virtuosity, of doing it, practicing it in an extremely artful and skillful way. And I think you see lots and lots of examples of this in China today. Despite all the challenges that the profession has faced, there's many wonderful practitioners doing many wonderful clinical things. And so that's sort of the hopeful note that I'd like to end the talk on, and which that's also the way that the book ends as well. So thanks. Let's pause here, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Well, I've got a quick one, and then I know Andy has some.
Okay.
Is the 5th edition available, translated into English, of the textbook that is still referred to and used by?
A good question. I would say that so I'm less familiar with the textbooks that schools use here. But I would say, let me give you an example of say Ted Kapchuk, who's very famous, and I think a great scholar. If you take The Web That Has No Weaver, that book, which is a wonderful book, and I like to use it myself. That book is in essence sort of a translation of probably two of your key textbooks, Basic Theory and Chinese Medicine Diagnosis, an abridged translation. So I think a lot of the books that we have today are translations of various kinds. What they're working on as the original text, though, I'm not so sure about. So I don't know. I can't give you specifically how much of the 5th edition gets into, I don't know, Macchiocho or other scholars.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, though. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think Kapchuk, I'm guessing, was probably working with the 5th edition. That's my guess. Actually, I could back up and say a few other things too about that. This I cover much more in the book as well. Prior to the 5th edition, the one that was kind of considered the best was the 2nd edition. So the textbooks, the first one comes out in 1960, and then it's kind of really considered provisional, and it's very quickly followed by another one in 1964. That's the 2nd edition, and that's the one where Deng Xiaoping mentioned that they introduced the term pattern discrimination and treatment determination. That becomes a bit of the gold standard, but of course 1964 is just 2 years before the Cultural Revolution. So it doesn't get used that much because in the Cultural Revolution, schools are closing, and education is completely turned upside down. And then when schools do reopen in the early 1970s, the emphasis is on practice, on kind of technical training, on things that are good for peasants and workers and soldiers. And what happens in Chinese medicine is that there's a third and fourth edition that come out. One, I think the third is in 1972, and the fourth might be 79 after the Cultural Revolution, but still very much clearly showing the effects of that sort of orientation. And we see what you might call a much more integrated kind of textbook. So, for example, the fourth edition internal medicine textbook actually has 2 volumes, and one volume lists is a Chinese medicine, is more of a Chinese medicine volume, and it's list according to the Bing, the Chinese medicine categories. So that's things like stomach ache, headache, what have you, obstruction or B syndrome, things like that, with your various sorts of patterns and how to treat those and formulas for those patterns. And then there's a whole nother volume which is based on biomedicine, and so it gives you biomedical diseases with a whole description of the disease in a biomedical framework, and then treatments according to Chinese medicine. So breaking down the disease into, again, to different variants or stages, but through this idea of pattern, and then giving different treatments for that. So the fifth edition then kind of gets away from that. That's to Cultural Revolution. That's to leftist, and it goes back to something more similar to the second edition, but a fuller version of that. Yeah. And it's published in the I think in 1984, 85, around that time. And so the early 80s are also an interesting moment of kind of Chinese medicine revival following the Cultural Revolution, where kind of the Maoist line was always this highly integrated practice, which meant like really this sort of very intense kind of like and very kind of contrived kind of hybridity, if you will. So the fifth edition kind of moves away from that, tries to rejects that in a sense, and tries to kind of write a textbook that really makes almost very little reference to biomedicine, although it's not to say that there aren't influences in the background, but hope that answers questions. And any more? Oh, so maybe there's a few questions in the chat I'm seeing.
Dr. Karshmer, if you don't mind, yes. I'll interrupt just briefly here for a moment. We have, let me just quickly refer, in the Q&A, we had Rob Hoffman again, who again is a CEO at Yosan University in LA. And
no,
he referred to a...
I'm sorry, he's saying he's not.
He's not?
No. He has a business called Plain Talk Practice.
Yeah, I know, Ellen, but actually he has both. He's actually the CEO at Yosan University in LA, and he also has a CEU course on clinician and client communication, and he put that website in the Q&A. That's been shared in the chat. We also have today, I think, Rob Hayden, who has been a long time clinician, but also an instructor in South Florida. And I think that rather than in the Q&A, he put something in the chat. And he says here that, as far as he knows, the Weissman-Ellis translation, Fundamentals, is a translation of the Fundamentals book that you were referring to, and he's not sure which edition. But that Weissman-Ellis translation was done quite some time ago. So that if that is a translation of Zhongyi Shui Jishu, then that was like, who knows which edition that was. That was like several editions ago.
That would have been, I'm not sure. That would have been, and that one, that is, I believe, maybe one of that might have been a late Cultural Revolution textbook. So that if you were to learn, when you learned in the 90s, or I think even today in China, you would learn 中医学基础, so it's a slightly different. Oh, hold on. Now I'm getting a 基础理论. Today it's called 基础理论, 中医基础理论. So it's got a different title, sort of basic theory of Chinese medicine. That I think that is the 5th edition and 6th edition title. And then I think again there's sort of different presses that probably use that same title. The one that Wiseman and Ellis translated might have been an earlier edition, because one of the things that happens with that particular textbook is prior to the Cultural Revolution, there wasn't anything called Basics of Chinese Medicine. There was actually, so this is quite interesting, there was actually just a big course on the inner canon, and any kind of basic theory was sort of in this big course in the inner canon. What happens post kind of Cultural Revolution is that, or during the Cultural Revolution, because the idea of the Cultural Revolution is simplify, popularize, make this thing available to the masses, is a new textbook. So maybe that's the one that Wiseman and Ellis translate. It's kind of carved off as sort of like the basic principles. And I think it had this different title. And it's sort of carved out of the inner canon textbook, and the inner canon book text becomes a little bit smaller, and that whole course becomes less hours. So that was sort of the training I got, was maybe, let's just say roughly, maybe it was 100 hours of training. When I took it, it might have been 200 in kind of like the late 50s and early 60s, when it was a different course with kind of more in that textbook. So that might have been, and to my knowledge, Wiseman and Ellis, neither of them studied in China. I know Andy. I'd love to ask him about that translation. I think they both are kind of coming from Taiwan, so they're kind of translating, but coming out of maybe some different Taiwan traditions, and bringing probably aspects of that their own training into that translation. Be kind of great to interview them both on how they did that.
Dr. Carter, pardon me for this interruption. This is my error, but I think that there's a quick correction on the Rob Hoffman that I'm confusing. I assume that he might have been in my home state, California, but actually he is based in Florida. He's, same name as the CEO of Yosan University, but he's based in Florida.
Okay. Well, thanks, Rob, for your questions. I hope I answered that first question. I think was about, I think about, now I don't see it, but about sort of the blending, that sort of question of blending, and I don't know if I got to it, but I would say that to come back to it, circle back to it, I think that would be a kind of an example of maybe outside of China, here in the U.S. perhaps, of different ways that people are pulling these two medical traditions together. And that's, to me, is sort of this new thing that couldn't happen and wasn't possible in an earlier historical moment.
And more we have practitioners working in medical settings.
Yes, we do. I think still, I would still say maybe compared to what it's like in China, still maybe on the margins of it.
Oh yeah.
But one of the things, and I have a whole chapter on this in the book, is sort of just following a patient very closely, is one of the things that happens in hospitals. A hospital of Chinese medicine in China is a hospital run almost predominantly by doctors of Chinese medicine. There might be a handful of people with some just only Western medicine training, perhaps in surgical departments or something. But so then what happens, very interesting, this would be different from a place like Taiwan, for example, is that, then sort of that whole post-colonial kind of like contradiction is like, then like, focused on onto the bodies of the doctors. They've got to kind of find a way to kind of deal with each patient, and do this double diagnosis, come up with a Western medicine diagnosis and a Chinese medicine diagnosis. So there's a lot of pressure to kind of get the Western medicine right. It's not acceptable to have like the wrong Western medicine diagnosis. So especially young doctors feel a tremendous amount of pressure to really master Western medicine first, and that's just a very difficult conflict that I think they have to face, because it takes them away from some of their, it takes them away from Chinese medicine. And it can also, depending on the moment, I came across many young doctors that weren't even that interested in Chinese medicine. They're like, all of the most important things they had to learn were clearly Western medicine on those, certainly for their early years. And so, whether they're going to circle back and get to like really work on their Chinese medicine skills later wasn't always clear.
I had the impression over the years, couldn't tell you where I learned it, that China had 3 different types of hospitals: Western, Chinese medicine only, and the combined. Is that not the case?
Yeah, that's not, I think I know where that comes from. I would say no, that's not really true. Although it may be on paper, but not in practice. So there was a moment kind of post-Cultural Revolution where in the world of Chinese medicine, like the political, like policy said, there's now going to be 3 paths or 3 tracks, and that's going to be Western medicine, Chinese medicine, and then integrated medicine. So let me just back up and explain integrated medicine. Integrated medicine, well, that's my translation, but in the Chinese is 中西医结合. That is kind of that was like a special program that was really promoted by Mao in the late 1950s, which was to take doctors of Western medicine, so already practicing, I think ideally somebody who's like finished their residency, like an attending physician, and then train them also in Chinese medicine, with the idea or the thought being that, with that kind of background in Western medicine, then they'd be trained in Chinese medicine, they're going to sort of come up with some sort of new medicine, some sort of dialectical superseding of the two, the 2 systems, right? The best of both worlds, if you will. So that becomes its own track, integrated medicine. And there are some hospitals later that sort of claim that title, integrated medicine. An example of that would be in Beijing, you have the Sino-Japanese Hospital, which is a hospital which is very near the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine. Long story there, originally built by it, but then taken over by the Ministry of Health. That's a hospital that was, unlike other hospitals of Chinese medicine, had a very extensive staffing and departments that are just dedicated to biomedicine, and then tried to bring in a lot of Chinese medicine as well. The result, though, is I would say it wasn't anything that was really radically different than what you just find at like Dongjimen Hospital. So what happens is that the Chinese medicine hospitals are ideally supposed to be all about Chinese medicine, but they end up not being just about Chinese medicine because there's so much pressure to get the biomedicine part of it right too. So they end up being very combined or integrated in a certain kind of different understanding of that term. And then integrated medicine then also kind of loses its steam because post-Cultural Revolution, there isn't this push to train the biomedical doctors in Chinese medicine. There's not the Maoist political kind of project. There's no drive to that anymore. Not to mention, there are sometimes Western medicine doctors coming into the program. That's relatively limited. So instead, you just have kind of from the 80s on, just doctors of Chinese medicine. The practice of Chinese medicine is just very much a dual medicine kind of degree, if you will. And that's actually not terribly different than, well, there's plenty of overlaps with what you'd find in Taiwan. And then Western medicine is kind of its own thing. And if you were in a general hospital of Western medicine, what you would find is just maybe a department of Chinese medicine. That's kind of a requirement. Although there's sort of this somewhat small group, marginalized group. And then beyond that, you might find, although it just really depends on the doctor, certain doctors that are interested in either acupuncture or herbal medicine, and doctors of Western medicine, and then maybe incorporate some of that into their practice, but that's very much according to their own interests. So for example, dermatology, there's a lot of great herbal medicine solutions. So I certainly heard about many dermatologists, biomedical dermatologists, who would like to prescribe certain herbal formulas for their patients. But that's again not a requirement. That's a sort of according to their interest. So this is kind of the post-colonial distinction here. So the biomedical doctors can do as much or as little Chinese medicine as they want, and doing absolutely none is completely fine. They may be required to take a course in it, but they don't have to practice it at all. Whereas doctors of Chinese medicine must do both. They really have to learn biomedicine. They obviously are doctors of Chinese medicine. They're very aware of that sort of status. So they've got to kind of do that as well. Although I saw many people who wanted to just get out of Chinese medicine and just be a doctor of Western medicine. But they're sort of, if they stay in the profession, they're very much have to do both. So that's part of that fundamental inequality there.
Dr. Karchmer, I hope you'll pardon me again. We're about 15 minutes to the top of the hour.
Okay.
And I wanted to just mention to the attendees, we've had, I think, both Rob Hoffman, again, from Florida, not from California. And also we've had, Rob Hayden, who's also in South Florida. Both of them have mentioned themselves in the questions. But Heidi, I think we have Heidi Jones with us from San Francisco. She is here in my area today. She's with us, I believe, on here. And then we have another person, Marpo, not sure from what place, but if either of them have questions, either Heidi Jones or Marpo, you can maybe raise your hand and we can ask you to unmute if you prefer to speak, or you can maybe include a question or any reaction that you want to share in the Q&A or maybe in the chat, I don't know. But maybe you could mention to us what place you're from and how you found out about the event. I will sort of wait for any other questions from our attendees today. And I have a few questions of my own that relate to sort of what I know about your book, how long I've known about it. I think the last time that you and I saw each other was probably 17 years ago when we were at an academic conference on Asian medicine.
Yep.
And I don't think any clinical people would remember that conference other than the people who were actually presenters there. But that was at UT Austin. That's my way of saying briefly that this book has been a very long time in the making. It started, I believe, probably as Professor Dr. Karchmer's PhD dissertation at UNC Chapel Hill during that time. His PhD advisor at UNC Chapel Hill was Professor Farquhar, and she is the one who I think interviewed Deng Tiatao many, many years ago. Deng Tiatao, for those of you who went through TCM school here in the US, if that name doesn't sound familiar, it would be recognized maybe by the fact that his book was translated by Marne Ergel as Practical Diagnosis in TCM. Those of you who went through TCM school, even not that long ago, would maybe remember it referred to as the Purple Book. And the Purple Book, in some cases, might have been, used in your school. I know that it was, I don't know, one of the required books on the California licensing exam, quite some time ago. But yeah, Deng Tiatao. I also read recently when he passed away, making it to the triple digits in his age, that he was actually involved and influential in mainland China's reaction to the first SARS virus. I'm not going to call that, the pre-coronavirus, but that was the first SARS virus back in 2002-03, which sort of hit in southern China and sort of Southeast Asia at that time. So yeah, I mean, Deng Tiatao, is really, really well known. And I remember in your book too, Dr. Karchmer, that you interviewed briefly Wang Zhuyi, who I think some of you attending today may know as, the author of a book called Applied Channel Theory in Chinese Medicine.
That's correct. I did get to interview Wang Zhuyi, who was who I really loved, very fascinating individual, and there's a vignette that from that interview in the book that I really love. Although he's not really he's really a doctor that trained in he was one of the first class, maybe the first classes of students at the new colleges. They weren't called universities, and new colleges of Chinese medicine, and that started in 1956. So those are sort of post-communist era. There were private schools, some experiments in private schools that began in the 20s and 30s. They were relatively few in number and relatively small, so they didn't really train that many doctors. Most of them don't make it through kind of World War II, so they're all kind of for various reasons, but the war being a big one. So they're all, so the colleges sort of start again in 1956. Wang Zhuyi was a part of that first class. I'll respond, Andy, quickly to the COVID and SARS kind of thing. Deng Tiatao, I don't think he was directly involved in treating SARS patients. I've seen people say that. I think that's not true. However, he was he may have been consulted a little bit from behind the scenes. Certainly, some of his students were on the front lines, I'm sure. But Guangzhou was an important. It is kind of an important thing in the world of Chinese medicine, and there's a chapter in the book about sort of the treatment of acute diseases. And this is something he found very important. So the SARS epidemic is a bit of a turning point in the world of Chinese medicine in kind of the 21st century. It was an epidemic in China. It didn't quite spread to the world like, SARS was an epidemic, but it didn't spread to the world like COVID did. But there was a tremendous amount of fear about it. The morbidity rate was, or mortality rate was much higher. But in Guangzhou, Chinese medicine doctors, because it started there, they got quite involved in the treatment, which is different than other parts of China where actually officials were trying to keep Chinese medicine doctors away from patients, and they're isolating patients in special hospitals and only letting biomedical doctors treat them. In Guangzhou, because it started there and they had the most number of patients, one of the hospital attached or affiliated with the Guangzhou College of Chinese Medicine was quite involved, and I think doctors were kind of surprised that they were getting some results because the biomedical treatments were seemingly so unhelpful, and it was often extremely high doses of steroids, which if it did work, it had horrible side effects in the end. People had to have they had necrosis of the femoral head and things like that. And so there was a kind of a surprise that Chinese medicine was working. And by the end of it, because it lasted for quite a few months, there was even some government recognition that Chinese medicine doctors had done something pretty effective. They'd done something. They'd gotten some better results than most other people, and that there was kind of something to it. And I think it surprised both the world doctors in the world of Chinese medicine, but it surprised officials too. And so when SARS hits, almost 20 years later, there was a much bigger Chinese medicine involvement from the beginning. Still, it's predominantly doctors of Western medicine, but I've got a new paper I'm working on that looks at some of the involvement of doctors of Chinese medicine. And doctors of Chinese medicine went into SARS much more confident. You could just sort of say, broadly speaking, much more like we can treat these sort of things. And one of the points that Deng Tiatao wanted to make back in the I interviewed him in several times and maybe 2005, but also 2009 and 11, was that Chinese medicine doctors can treat acute diseases like SARS or like COVID, and that was something that doctors of Chinese medicine were definitely not confident of in the 1990s. And one of the interesting things, and this is a whole other chapter in the book, is that folks like Deng Tiatao, but not just him, many doctors of these older generation, kind of pre-Wang Jui, when I asked them what were the things you treated in your clinical practice in the 1930s or 40s, they all talked about treating acute diseases. They all talked about treating measles, smallpox, typhoid, dengue fever, what have you. And I remember sort of being stunned by all those accounts, but it just repeated from interviewee to interviewee. And what doctors said, actually at that time, and there weren't a lot of biomedical treatments, first of all, and for any of those problems, in the 30s and 40s. And what they all told me is that if you're going to be a doctor of Chinese medicine, you're going to be good at treating acute infectious diseases. Now that after the 50s, that shifts dramatically, and for various reasons, and doctors of Chinese medicine really shift to focus on chronic diseases of all kinds. But that was a big shift, and that was something that Deng Tiatao was very excited about it. I remember him repeating it several times to me across a couple of interviews. He's like, no, the doctors treating SARS were very successful. It's very important. You must understand this. You must understand that the Chinese medicine doctors can do these things too. But he understood that young doctors didn't have the knowledge or like him, the experience that he had when he was a young doctor of doing that kind of clinical work.
Dr. Karshmer, thank you very much for your extended answer there. with about 5 minutes to the top of the hour, I'll just interrupt myself and say again that if either Heidi from San Francisco or any of the other attendees have any question at all, or any, anything they want to share with our author here today, please interrupt me in the next couple minutes, and I'll just sort of stop whatever I'm saying, or we'll interrupt what we're doing. I will briefly say, Dr. Karchmer, that yeah, your book has an epilogue, I think, which is only a couple of pages, but you talk about how, I think if you weren't on the mainland, you were in Taiwan or you were somewhere in the region as the world changed 3 years ago, around March of 2020. So, you talk about how you were there on the ground, seeing how, let's call it the second SARS virus, which technically Corona is referred to as SARS-2, if you will. You were seeing how, they were dealing with it in that region. If TCM or whatever had a role, acupuncture and herbal treatment, in hospital settings or otherwise. Um, but yeah, your book has that short epilogue.
Yeah, I have a short epilogue on that. So I wasn't on the ground in mainland China during the COVID outbreak. Although I had a couple of colleagues who were there and got to interview a few doctors before it kind of became politically too difficult to do that. So the epilogue kind of refers a little bit to some of their interview work. But I was also on the ground. I was then subsequently in Taiwan during the sort of COVID outbreak there, and certainly got to watch plenty of doctors treating COVID there. And there were some interesting sort of alternative approaches that were very popular in Taiwan that were different than the approaches in mainland China. But again, kind of, I would say, and I don't know the history of Taiwan as well as I do mainland China, but it was clear that there was but people in Taiwan follow what's going on in the mainland, and it was clear there was sort of a bit of a turning point in Taiwan too, a bit of a shift. There's a different history there, some different kinds of prejudices, but also some interesting dialogues between the two professions as well, and got to follow some of the doctors who I thought were doing kind of some exciting treatments of COVID there using Chinese medicine. So the Taiwan stuff isn't in the book, but a little bit of but there are some connections with in the epilogue of the book. There are a little bit of discussion of sort of what a few of my colleagues were able to do, the work that they were able to do in mainland China, and kind of tying it back to some of these important historical figures in the world of Chinese medicine in the mainland. Some of the stuff I got to see in Taiwan, that's kind of the next paper that I'm working on.
Wow. You'll forgive me with about a minute to the top of the hour. This is not necessarily the end, but I'm just waiting to see again briefly for a couple minutes if our attendees have any other insight. Heidi just sent a message here. But Dr. Karchmer, if you don't mind, I'm going to make a brief pitch, and I hope you're not turned off by this. And I believe that, one of your co-authors, I don't think that he would be turned off if he heard this either. But your book, this is my pitch, but your book, after all these years, reminds me, the closest thing to it was probably over 2 decades ago when I was a young undergrad student, and I found out about Volker Scheid's first book. A lot of people did not know Volker Scheid in the clinical field, until that book. But I think most of you may know Volker Scheid today as the co-author of the Revised Formulas and Strategies, the second edition of the Bensky Formulas textbook. But his first book was called Chinese Medicine in Contemporary China. This was published in 2002. It was a book about TCM in mainland China. And he talked about at that time how one quote I remember, this is over 2 decades ago, but he said that there were people who were doing integrative, or what you might call dual medicine, on the mainland, and there were some people he interviewed, younger, older, etc., who said that Chinese medicine can be used for emergency conditions in hospital settings. But if you either agree or disagree, or if you believe that, then the reverse is also true, which is that biomedicine or Western medicine, or what you want to call that, can also be effective for chronic conditions that are, maybe more likely in outpatient conditions or outpatient settings. But the only thing is do you believe that? And would it require like a shift in paradigm or a shift in not only belief, but a shift in practice? You would have to believe that TCM can be used in emergency cases and that biomedicine could be helpful in chronic cases. That's just one example I remember from that book. But what I really want to tell attendees today, and anybody listening to this webinar, if it's going to be shared after this, is, I believe that Dr. Karchmer's book, after all this time, is a lot shorter than Volkerscheid's first book. This is just me remembering 2 decades ago when I was reading Volkerscheid's book as an undergrad, but that book was not easy. Many of you, if you know this book and if you looked at it 20 years ago, you might have remembered the formulas and the case histories and all of the ethnography, or shall we say, like all of the on-the-ground action of TCM. But the anthropology sections, the so-called theoretical chapters, those were very, very dense. They were written in a very academic way. I find Dr. Karchmer's book to be so similar, but shorter and much easier to read. That is my pitch to say that Dr. Karchmer's book, and I think he tried to convey this in his slides in the beginning about 2 hours ago, is that, Ted Kapchuk has an endorsement on the back cover saying that both academic anthropologists, but also clinical TCM people, both in the East and West, should look at this book. But my further claim is that I believe that they could look at it even if they are not trained, in the other area. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that clinicians could probably follow the academic parts of, Dr. Karchmer's book and not really have to read a lot of jargon or know a lot of anthropology. I'm not really sure if the historians and anthropologists would really be able to follow, the technical stuff about cases and formulas and histories. But Dr. Karchmer's book is short. I believe that you can read it. It is academic. I'm not going to lie and say that it isn't, but it's not too academic, which is what I think Volkerscheid's first book 20 years ago probably was. This book, again, was published by the Fordham University Press. That is a smaller university press in New York. Many of you may be familiar with going to Amazon, but I will just make a brief pitch. For the next 2 weeks through August 15th, the Fordham University Press is offering a 25% discount on the paperback edition. And they're also offering free shipping. So that's a pretty good deal. What that means is that means that Dr. Karchmer's $30 paperback is going to drop to $22.50. And with free shipping, the tax will probably put it somewhere under $25. So those of you who haven't ordered it already, I think it might be a good deal. But again, Fordham University Press, this is only a deal through their website. It's at fordhampress.com. I think that the promo is at the top of their website. I think it might be 25 summer for 25% off -FI. You enter that into the shopping cart. And it's only good through August 15th. So that there's 2 weeks left to get that deal. But otherwise, if you miss that deal, Dr. Karchmer, I think you said that people can order this book through My Dow Labs if they call your company somehow.
Yes, so yeah, I do have. Thank you, Andy, so much. You're very generous. So yeah, you could. There are a few copies available through. I have a small herbal medicine company, mydowlabs.com, and so you could get it through there. So that's one possibility. But yeah, I think Fordham University Press is I didn't realize they had a sale. That's a great option, and Amazon is of course a good one too. Andy, you're very generous in your description of the book. But I would say I certainly wanted it to make it. And I read about this in the introduction. I really wanted to make it readable both for doctors and anthropologists. So I try to, I try to keep the jargon at a minimum. And so hopefully you'll. Although I know the reactions I've gotten so far is that it's still I didn't want it to read as an academic book. I think you'll probably still find it's an academic book, but hopefully at least it's a fun read. I've tried to keep it fun and interesting.
Okay, I'm going to share some screens. I've put the Fordham Press in the website in the chat for you. And there is a save 25%. Looks like it's maybe more than just this book. I'll copy and paste that in there, but it's at the top of the website for that. I'll also stick the Dow Labs if I can find it. I had it a second ago.
Thanks. Or I can type it in. So
it's just dowlabs.com.
My Dow Labs.
My Dow Labs. Okay.
Yeah. So and so I write for that blog too. So I have like sometimes I'll have I'm actually headed back to Taiwan for some to teach and some more research there. So I try to do on the My Doubt Labs. There's a blog. I try to do some like little clinical anecdotes and updates when I'm blog like things when I'm there. So that could be something fun to read too.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Karchmer.
All
Dr.
right.
Karchmer, forgive me for asking this. This is just between you and I, but like, how long do you think you may be in Taiwan? Will we not see you here in the U.S. for some time, do you think?
Well, I'm gonna be working in Taiwan, I think, for the next couple of years, probably. I think back in the US during summer breaks
Okay.
is the plan. So because it's very hot in Taiwan during the summer.
Yeah,
so
that's true. Very
like
hot.
let's
Yeah.
keep the heat, that'll be great. But yeah, I've got kind of a 1-year position lined up, and I'm hoping we'll see if it works out. But I'd like to get back to China Medical University is one of the older or it is the oldest Chinese medicine university in Taiwan, and so I'm being kind of recruited to work there too. So hopefully that works out. We'll see.
I feel we're really lucky to have you today, Dr. Karchmer. This is kind of a rare chance to catch you before you take off for the year, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, but I'll be available virtually from Taiwan too. So but I can't thank Andy. Can't thank you enough, and Ellen, for hosting this and a chance to kind of speak about the book and get the word out. And hopefully it was a good talk for all of you.
Yeah, I'll put out the recording to the people that signed up for it. And I just have to do one plug. This is the conference speakers for the 2023 FOSOMA conference. And I'm going to show you the schedule. The right-hand column here is available virtually. So you can sign up, and it's all experts in neurology and orthopedics. I think the right-hand track is mostly orthopedics. I put a link in the chat to it. Also, there's a bunch of YouTubes where you can see videos of the speakers and meet them a little bit beforehand, find out more about them. The other thing, this was a fundraiser for our legislative campaign. So I'm going to put that link in. We almost lost our title this year. We were lucky the governor vetoed the bill, but if anybody has not contributed and would like to, I've put that link in the chat as well. We're trying to get the term acupuncture physician into our statute. It's in our rules. The acronym is in our statute, but we didn't have the term, and that the Senate sponsor told us if we had, it wouldn't have been a problem. The House sponsor was a medical doctor, and he didn't want us no matter what. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Dr. Karchmer, thank you so much. Andy, thank you so much. Andy, like I said, is a book aficionado and has brought us some other authors as well. We had, we had another event last year, so we look forward to reading your next book, Dr. Karchmer, and enjoy your travels. I'll send you the recording when we get it downloaded, and send it out to everybody that attended and who didn't. We had a number of people didn't show up, so, but thank you so much. All right.
Thank you. And again, appreciate the opportunity, and best wishes to you all.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.